You hear the word Viking, and you think longships cutting through gray water, raids on foreign shores, warriors with axes. Nobody talks about the woman gripping the oak strakes while her body tears itself apart 3 days from any coast. Nobody talks about the baby born with salt spray on its skin and the father who looks at it once and makes a choice. A choice that happens in silence. A choice written into law. Between 790 and 1100, Norse men and women crossed the North Atlantic in open boats made of overlapping planks. They sailed to Iceland, to Greenland, to a place they called Vinland on the coast of North America. These weren't pleasure cruises. These were migration voyages lasting weeks. Women came too. The genetic evidence proves it. A 2014 study published by the Royal Society sequenced mitochondrial DNA from 45 Viking Age skeletons from Norway and confirmed what the sagas hinted at. Women sailed alongside men to settle new lands. In Orkney and Shetland, modern populations show equal ancestry from both Norse men and women. In Iceland, slightly more from men, but women were there. And where there are women on weeks-long ocean crossings, there are pregnancies, there are births. But here's what the sources don't tell you. Not one saga, not one chronicle, not one archaeological find gives us a first-hand account of a child born at sea on a Viking longship. The silence is loud. It's the kind of silence that makes you ask what happened to those stories, or if those babies survived long enough to become stories. If you value documented Viking Age history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the World History Encyclopedia's March 2025 article on childhood in the Viking Age by historians who cite Norwegian archaeological excavations and legal codes, and Nancy Wicker's 1998 Violence in Society in the Early Medieval West, published by Boydell Press, documenting infant exposure practices through saga analysis and burial evidence. We're also drawing from the National Museum of Denmark's Viking Age research on infant mortality and the 2012 Journal of the History of Sexuality study on Christianization and infanticide at Burka. Now back to the information. Let's start with what we know about childbirth on land in the Viking Age. Women gave birth kneeling. They started on their knees, then bent forward with elbows on the ground as labor progressed. No birthing chairs, no beds. No lying on your back. That didn't start until the 18th century in Europe. Viking Age midwifery was passed down through women who knew plants, knew pressure points, knew how to turn a baby. But even with that knowledge, 1 in 5 children died before their 5th birthday. The National Museum of Denmark states this plainly. Infant mortality was high. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, birth complications. Another near 20% didn't reach age 20. Life expectancy sat at 40 to 45 years. You didn't waste time being young. Now put that woman on a longship, a Carve or a Nur, those cargo ships that made the Atlantic crossings, 16 meters long, 4.6 meters wide. Clinker built, overlapping oak planks held with iron rivets, open to the sky, no deck, no shelter. The Gokstad ship, excavated in Norway and dating to around 890, shows us the design. 21 meters long, 5-meter beam. Shallow draft that let it navigate rivers and beach on shores. It could carry 20 to 30 crew plus cargo. The Nar was sturdier, built for ocean crossings, capable of carrying 24 tons of cargo, livestock, grain, people, possessions. But sturdy doesn't mean comfortable. These ships moved at 7 knots average speed. That's about 13 kilometers per hour. A voyage from Norway to Iceland following the insular route, Norway to Shetland, to Orkney, to Faroe, to Iceland, meant weeks at sea with brief stops. The ocean route, straight shot across open water, was faster if you hit it right, but put you out of sight of land for days. 3 weeks if all went well. The reconstructed Viking ship Draken Harald Hårfagre made Norway to Newfoundland in just over 5 weeks in spring 2016. That's modern crew, modern weather forecasting, modern safety. Viking Age crews had none of that. They had knowledge of winds, tides, whale sightings, the position of the sun, and something called havila, being bewildered at sea when fog or bad weather kills your sense of direction. Ships got lost, ships went down. The sagas mention this in passing like it's weather. On these voyages, space was cargo. Every meter mattered. The Sea Stallion, a reconstructed Viking ship, sailed from Roskilde to Dublin in 2008, 44 days. The crew wrote logs. They described cold, wet, exhaustion, the constant motion, sleeping in shifts, eating dried fish and hard bread, rationing fresh water, 1 gallon per person per day for drinking. That's tight. A 60-foot longship might carry 1,200 gallons, enough for 100 men for 12 days or 50 men for 24 days. Do the math on a 3-week crossing with 30 people and you see the margin. You don't waste water, you don't waste food, you don't waste space. So when a woman went into labor on that ship, what happened? We have to work backwards from what we know about Viking culture and law to build the picture. Let's start with the naming ritual. The Norwegian Frost-Athing law, codified around 1100 but reflecting earlier customs, stated that every child must have a father. After birth, the baby was brought to the father. He decided if he accepted the child, he named it. If he didn't, the child was considered uncarried. That status had serious legal consequences: exposure, abandonment, death. The 13th century Icelandic saga, Gunnlaug's Saga, preserves this in dialogue. A man named Thorstein tells his pregnant wife Jofridr, "So you are with child. If you should bear a girl, it shall be exposed, but if a boy, then it shall be raised." Casual, matter of fact. Scholars like Nancy Wicker, who analyzed this saga alongside burial evidence in her 1998 study for Boydell Press, note that the cavalier attitude suggests female infanticide wasn't exceptional. It was a known practice. The saga was written in the 13th century, well within the Christian period, but it's recalling 9th century norms. Archaeological evidence backs this up. Excavations at Rogaland in Norway uncovered infant skull fragments and hair deposited in a wetland during the Iron Age. 4 infant skulls, deliberately placed. Archaeologist Marianne Hem Eriksson noted in her 2017 World Archaeology article that previous theories assumed mothers wanted to keep dead babies close. Eriksson offers another interpretation. These were unwanted infants, exposed, disposed of in ritual contexts. Trelleborg in Denmark had sacrificial wells with child remains mixed with animal bones and ritual objects. Lake Tisø showed the same pattern. These weren't grieving burials. These were something else. The Gulathing law, incorporating parts of King Olaf's Christian law from the early 11th century, tried to end pagan infanticide practices. Tried, but even Christian law had exceptions. The Gulathing law explicitly allowed exposure of children born with serious deformities, reversed facial features, misplaced limbs, what the law called situs retroversus. Those children were to be brought to a church, converted from paganism, and left to die. That's the law. In writing, published in Lawrence Larsson's 1935 translation of Norwegian provincial laws, which pulls from 12th century manuscripts preserving 11th century legal codes. When Iceland converted to Christianity in the year 1000, Ari Thorgilsson's Islendingabok from around 1130 records the compromise. Everybody had to be Christian and undergo baptism. But concerning child exposure and eating horse meat, the old law should remain valid. They kept infanticide legal even after conversion. By the time the Grey Goose laws were written in the 12th century, the practice was abolished, but that's 2 centuries into Christianization. The transition was slow, the practice was entrenched. Nancy Wicker's research also points to burial patterns. In many Viking Age Scandinavian sites, adult male burials outnumber adult female burials drastically. Some cemeteries show ratios as skewed as 9-1 favoring males. Birka in Sweden is the exception. Women's graves outnumber men's graves there. Wicker's 2012 Journal of the History of Sexuality article argues that Birka's early Christianization, missionaries arrived in the 800s, meant the Christian interdiction against infanticide took hold earlier. More girls survived. More women lived to be buried. The contrast with pagan sites is stark. Now bring this back to the Longship. A woman goes into labor 3 days from Iceland. She's kneeling in the bottom of the ship between cargo bundles. The ship is moving. North Atlantic swells, cold, spray coming over the sides. She labors for hours, maybe a day. Viking women who traveled with the men weren't slaves. The DNA evidence from Oseberg ship burial and other high-status sites shows powerful women were buried with wealth, grave goods, sometimes other people sacrificed to accompany them. But even powerful women followed the law. Even powerful women had to present the baby to the father. The baby comes. If it's a healthy boy, the father might accept him, name him, wrap him in wool, try to keep him warm and fed until landfall. If it's a girl, or if it's a boy with any visible defect, the father has a choice. The law gives him that choice. Exposure. On land, that meant taking the baby outside the settlement and leaving it. On a ship, that means one thing. The North Atlantic, 2 degrees Celsius water temperature. A newborn can survive maybe minutes. Here's the cold math. A 3-week voyage from Norway to Iceland via the ocean route. A woman is 7 months pregnant when the voyage starts, still within what medieval sources considered travelable. She goes into labor 2 weeks in. She delivers a girl. The father looks at the extra mouth to feed. Fresh water is rationed. Food is rationed. Space is cargo. They're still a week from land. What are the odds he risks the ship's supplies, the crew's morale, the luck of the voyage for a female infant? The saga evidence suggests exposure was the expected outcome for unwanted girls even on land. At sea, it's simpler. No walking to the woods, no leaving the child in a spot where maybe a passerby finds her, just water. We don't have written accounts of this because infants weren't commemorated. The World History Encyclopedia's 2025 article on Viking Age childhood notes that no runestones were raised in memory of children. Burial evidence for children is surprisingly scarce. Scholars debate whether children were buried separately, buried in ways that don't preserve, or simply not buried with markers. Infant bodies are notably underrepresented in the Scandinavian Iron Age archaeological record. Howard Williams, a British archaeologist who writes about Viking mortuary practices, stated in a 2020 blog post that infant graves are unlikely to register at all in the archaeological record. The children who were exposed, who were deemed uncarried, who never received names, they left no trace. So we're left with inference. Women traveled on Viking ships. The genetic evidence proves it. Voyages lasted weeks. The historical evidence proves it. Pregnancies happened. Biology proves it. Some women must have gone into labor at sea. Logic proves it. What happened to those babies depends on whether the father accepted them. Law proves it. And the law, in pre-Christian Scandinavia, allowed exposure. Multiple sources prove it. Let's look at one specific voyage. The settlement of Iceland began around 874, according to Ari Thorgilsson's calculations, confirmed by modern archaeology. Ingolfur Arnarsson and his wife Halveigs Frodadottir are credited as the first permanent settlers. They sailed from Norway. They arrived in Reykjavik. The sagas don't mention if Halveig was pregnant during the crossing. They don't mention any births at sea. But over the next 60 years, the entire coastline of Iceland was settled. That's thousands of people making the crossing. Many in family groups. The Icelandic sagas and the genetic evidence both confirm that women and children came. Not all the women could have timed their pregnancies to avoid sea travel. Not all the babies could have waited for landfall. Freydis, Eirik's daughter, Eric the Red's daughter, traveled to Vinland, North America, around the year 1000. The saga of Eric the Red describes her fighting local inhabitants with a sword while pregnant. She made multiple ocean crossings. The saga doesn't say she gave birth at sea, but it doesn't say she didn't. Silence. Always silence around the vulnerable moments. If you value documented Viking Age history that doesn't shy away from the uncomfortable parts, subscribe. Also comment which city you're watching from. This research comes from multiple deep sources. H. Eriksson's 2017 World Archaeology article titled, "Don't All Mothers Love Their Children?" Examining deposited infants as animate objects in Scandinavian Iron Age ritual contexts. And the Norwegian archaeological reports from excavations at Rogaland and Trelleborg showing physical evidence of infant remains in non-burial contexts. We're also using the reconstructed voyage data from the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde, documenting the Sea Stallion's 2008 Dublin crossing. Now back to the information. The Oseberg ship burial, excavated in 1904 in Norway, gives us a glimpse of how Vikings thought about ships and death. Two women, one around 70 to 80 years old, one around 50 to 55, were buried in a magnificently carved ship around 834. The burial chamber was in the stern. The ship was placed with the prow facing the sea. It was filled with everything they'd need for the afterlife: beds, tapestries, clothes, farming tools, a cart, 15 horses, 6 dogs, 2 cows. The ship itself measured 21 meters long and 5 meters wide. It was seaworthy. A 2014 reconstruction proved it could sail, achieving 10 knots under full sail. The symbolism matters. Ships carried you to the afterlife. Ships carried you across water to new lands. Ships were wealth, power, family identity. The Oseberg women were powerful. One may have been Queen Osa, mother of Halfdan the Black, grandmother of Harold Fairhair, who united Norway. The other woman's DNA, according to a disputed 2007 study by Per Holk, suggested mitochondrial haplogroup U7, maternal ancestors from the Pontic littoral, possibly Iran. Later studies questioned the DNA results due to contamination, but the implication was clear. Women from far away traveled to Norway. Women married into Viking society. Women crossed seas, and when those women gave birth on those seas, in those ships that were sacred enough to bury queens in a syngi, the outcome depended on a man's decision. The Frostithing law is explicit. Every child must have a father. The baby is brought to the father. He names it, or he doesn't. Uncarried is the legal term. It means exposed. It means dead. This wasn't unique to Vikings. The practice of infant exposure was common in ancient Greece and Rome. Aristotle wrote that no deformed child should live. In Greece, the father decided. In Sparta, a council of elders decided. In Rome, The paterfamilias brought the newborn forth and chose whether to raise it or expose it. The 12 tables of Roman law required him to kill visibly deformed children. Christianity changed this. The 4th century made infanticide a capital offense in Roman law, but the Vikings weren't Christian until later. Norway's conversion happened gradually through the 10th and 11th centuries. Iceland converted in the year 1000, but kept exposure legal for years after. The old ways persisted. Modern cruise ships don't allow pregnant women past 24 weeks. 24 weeks is about 6 months. That's the cutoff. Carnival, Royal Caribbean, Norwegian Cruise Line, Princess, all the major lines have the same policy. No pregnant passengers past 24 weeks. Why? Because ships don't have obstetric facilities. They don't have neonatal intensive care. They don't have specialists. If something goes wrong, preterm labor, hemorrhage, fetal distress, the ship has to get to port fast or arrange emergency evacuation. Even modern ships with modern medicine and modern communication can't handle childbirth safely. And those ships have doctors, nurses, medical supplies, satellite phones, helicopters on call. Viking longships had none of that. They had knowledge passed down through women who'd seen births before. They had whatever herbs and plants they brought. They had wool for warmth, leather for water, prayers to Freya, the fertility goddess. They had the father's decision. That's it. The reconstructed voyage data tells us what those crossings were like. The Drake and Harold Horfagger's 2016 Atlantic crossing logged daily conditions, storms, headwinds that slowed progress to a crawl. Days when they couldn't row because the waves were too high. Nights when they took down the sail and rode it out, cold that went through wool and leather, wet that never dried, exhaustion that compounded. And that's with modern safety gear. Modern weather forecasting, modern navigation. Viking age crews were tougher, more experienced, better adapted, but they were human. They got sick, they got injured, they died. A woman in active labor on a ship in those conditions is facing death, hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labor, the baby facing death, cord prolapse, fetal distress, hypothermia. Even if everything goes right, even if mother and baby survive the birth, you've got a newborn on an open boat in the North Atlantic with a week to go before landfall. Newborns need warmth, they need colostrum, then breast milk, they need to be kept dry. They need protection from the elements. All of that is nearly impossible on a Viking ship. So the father's decision becomes a survival decision for the ship. Not just the baby, the ship. If the baby is a boy, healthy, strong lungs, no visible defects, maybe he's worth the risk. Vikings valued male children for labor, for warfare, for carrying on the family name. But if it's a girl, or if it's a weak boy, or if there's any sign of defect, the math changes. The crew is watching. The cargo is counting on safe arrival. The father weighs the child against the ship. Here's what we know from the archaeological record about unwanted infants. Ha in Rogaland, Norway, 4 infant skulls. Deliberately deposited in a wetland, Iron Age context. The excavation report describes this as ritual deposition. The infants were placed alongside animal bones. This wasn't a cemetery. This wasn't a family burial. This was disposal with ceremony. Scholar Greta Lillehammer wrote about this in her study Children in the Bog, published in 2000. She notes that bogs and wetlands in Scandinavia often contain infant remains that don't fit burial patterns. They're placed, not buried. They're marked, not hidden. They're part of something. Ritual, offering, acknowledgement. Trelleborg in Denmark. Sacrificial wells. Child remains mixed with ritually killed animals, horses, dogs, and objects. These were foundation deposits, scholars think. Offerings to gods or land spirits when the fortress was built around 980. But the children were real. They were killed. They were placed deliberately. The line between sacrifice and exposure blurs. Birka in Sweden breaks the pattern. Excavations. There show more women's graves than men's graves, unusual for Viking Age Scandinavia. The site dates from 750 to 950. It was a trading hub, proto-urban, international. Missionaries arrived early. Ansgar, the monk who tried to convert the Swedes, came to Birka in the 800s. Christianity took root earlier there than elsewhere. And Nancy Wicker's analysis shows that the shift from pagan burial patterns to Christian ones coincides with an increase in female burials. Her argument, backed by comparison with other sites, is that Christian interdiction against infanticide meant more girls survived childhood, more women lived to be buried. The ratios evened out. At pagan sites, the ratio stays skewed, more men than women in the graves. Some scholars argue this is because women died in childbirth and weren't buried in formal cemeteries. Maybe. But the saga evidence, the legal evidence, the comparative evidence from other cultures that practiced infanticide, all of it points to selective female infanticide as part of the explanation. here's the part that sticks. The 13th century, when the sagas were written down, was Christian. Iceland had been Christian for 200 years, Norway for at least that. But the saga authors preserved these details. Thorstein telling his wife to expose a girl, characters discussing it like weather, no moral judgment in the text itself. Why preserve it? Because it was how things were. Because the oral tradition remembered. Because the people who first told these stories lived through it. The Icelandic family sagas, Njal's saga, Egil's saga, Laxdæla saga, were composed in the 13th and 14th centuries but describe events from 930 to 1030. The authors were working from oral tradition, from family memory, from cultural knowledge passed down through generations. Modern scholars debate how historically accurate they are. Some argue they're artistic creations by individual authors. Others argue they preserve real oral tradition. The truth is probably both. But even if the specific events are fictionalized, the cultural details, how people lived, how law worked, how families operated, those details had to ring true to the audience. If saga authors portrayed infanticide casually, it's because their audience knew about it. It was part of living memory. Aud the Deep-Minded, one of the most famous women in the sagas, organized a ship voyage to Iceland in the late 9th century after her husband and son died. She brought her grandchildren, her household, probably other families. She became one of Iceland's most important settlers. The saga doesn't say if any births happened on that crossing. It doesn't say if any infants were exposed. Silence. Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, described in the sagas as the most traveled woman of her time, made multiple crossings, Iceland to Greenland, Greenland to Vinland and back, Vinland to Iceland, Iceland to Norway, Norway to Rome. She outlived 3 husbands. She had a son, Snorri, born in Vinland around the year 1010, the first European child born in North America. The saga preserves his name because he survived, grew up, had descendants. But what about the pregnancies that didn't result in named children? What about the babies born at sea who never got names? They're not in the sagas. They're not in the burial record. They're gone. The silence around infant death in Viking Age sources is deafening. No runestones, few grave goods in children's burials, legal provisions for exposure, saga, casualness about disposal, archaeological underrepresentation. All of it points to a culture that didn't memorialize children who died young, especially children who died unnamed, uncarried, outside the community. Not people yet. We can't say for certain that Viking women gave birth on longships and fathers threw infants overboard. We don't have that account. But we can say that women traveled on longships for weeks at a time. We can say that pregnancies would have occurred. We can say that Viking Age law allowed and expected fathers to expose unwanted infants. We can say that exposure at sea is simpler than exposure on land. We can say that infant mortality was already catastrophic. 1 in 5 dead before age 5, even with the survivors. We can say that ships were cramped, resources were tight, and extra mouths to feed were extra weight. We can say that male children were valued over female children to the point where saga characters discuss exposing daughters like it's inevitable. From those facts, you draw the line. A woman labors in the bottom of a ship, 3 days from Iceland, North Atlantic wind. The baby is born. The father looks. He decides. This is the part where a normal documentary would tell you that maybe it wasn't so bad. Maybe fathers usually chose mercy. Maybe women found ways to save their daughters. Maybe the law was rarely enforced. But that's not what the evidence shows. The law existed because the practice existed. The sagas mention it because it happened. The burial ratios show fewer women because fewer girls survived. The archaeological infant deposits show disposal because infants were disposed of. Burke's Christian shift shows the change because Christianity changed the practice. If exposure wasn't common, there'd be no need to outlaw it. If it wasn't expected, there'd be no need to write it into saga dialogue. King Olaf's Christian law in the early 11th century specifically targeted infanticide. That means it was prevalent enough to require legal intervention. The Gulething law's exception for deformed infants means even Christian law couldn't eliminate the practice entirely. Parents and communities pushed back. They wanted the option. Disabled children were expensive. Disabled children couldn't work. Disabled children were bad omens in a culture that valued strength and martial prowess. So the law bent. You could expose a child with situs retroversus, take them to a church, convert them, let them die. That compromise held for decades. By the 12th century, the Grey Goose laws in Iceland eliminated the exception. Exposure was illegal, but that's 200 years after Iceland's conversion in the year 1000. 200 years of Christian teaching, Christian law, Christian morality. And still it took that long to stop. On Viking longships crossing the North Atlantic between 790 and 1100, no such laws existed. Christianity was a foreign religion. The gods were Odin, Thor, Freya, the Aesir, and Vanir. Strength mattered. Survival mattered. Family honor mattered. Children mattered only if they could grow into adults who mattered. Infants were potential, not persons. Uncarried was a legal category. Exposure was a father's right. In this context, a baby born at sea had one chance: impress the father, be male, be healthy, be loud, show strength. Anything less, and the North Atlantic was waiting. Here's the detail that never leaves you. The Oseberg ship women were buried with a cart. Scholars think the cart was ceremonial, possibly used in rituals honoring Freya. Freya was the goddess of fertility, love, beauty, but also war and death. She received half the slain warriors in her hall Folkvanger. The other half went to Odin's Valhalla. Freya was about life and death together, fertility and killing intertwined. Women prayed to her for children. Women prayed to her for safe births, and women, presumably, acknowledged her when births didn't go well, when babies were exposed, when the line between blessing and curse was a father's decision. The Oseberg tapestry. Fragments of it preserved in the burial may show a procession. Horse-drawn carts, people, movement, journey. The ship itself is a journey, carved with intricate animal motifs, ribbon beasts, gripping creatures from Norse mythology. It's art, it's sacred, it's transport to the next world, but it was also functional. The 2014 reconstruction proved it could sail, 10 knots under full sail, seaworthy, real. If powerful women like the Oseberg queens traveled by ship, if they were buried in ships, then ships were part of women's lives, not just waiting at home for men to return. Active participation, crossing seas, settling lands, and on those crossings, giving birth, laboring in the space between strakes, kneeling on oak planks worn smooth by seawater, breathing salt air, feeling the ship move under her like a living thing, and then the father's decision. Named or uncarried, raised or exposed, memory or silence. In 2003, a farmer in Oseberg found a piece of carved wood while digging, 8 inches long, intricate patterns. He brought it to Professor Gabriel Gustafsson at the University Museum in Oslo. Gustafsson recognized it immediately, Viking Age craftsmanship. The excavation began. They found the ship, they found the women, they found the grave goods. They found 14 horses, an ox, 3 dogs. They found everything except a clear answer about who the women were. Queen Osa, a priestess, both powerful, both wealthy, both dead around 834. The horses and dogs were killed to accompany the women. Ritual sacrifice. The women needed them in the afterlife. Animals were valuable, especially 14 horses, but they were killed without hesitation because that's what the dead required. If a culture kills 14 horses to honor 2 dead women, that culture understands sacrifice. That culture understands that life and death are transactional, that the living give to the dead, that the powerful take from the weak, that fathers decide for infants. Every Viking Age burial with animal sacrifices reinforces this. Gokstad ship, 12 horses, 6 dogs, and the peacock. Ladby ship, 11 horses, 4 dogs. These weren't pets lovingly buried. These were valuable livestock killed because ritual demanded it. Life was currency. Death was transition. Infants who died before naming hadn't yet entered the community. They weren't people. They were potential that never manifested. Like the horses and dogs, they were transactional. But unlike the horses and dogs, they didn't even warrant ritual treatment. Exposure was disposal, not sacrifice. There's a mass grave at Ridgeway Hill in Dorset, England. 51 young men, all beheaded, all buried together around 970 to 1030. DNA analysis and isotope studies suggest they were Scandinavian, Vikings, captured and executed, most likely during a raid gone wrong. Some had filed teeth, grooves cut into their incisors, a practice seen in Scandinavian and Baltic skeletons from this period. The filing may have been decorative or ritual. The point is, they were Vikings, and they died violently far from home. And they were dumped in a pit together. That's what happens when you lose, when you're vulnerable, when you have no power, no ship burial, no grave goods, no honor, just a pit and obscurity. The Ridgeway Hill men were warriors. They had names, families, probably some status before they died, and still they ended up in a mass grave. How much less would a nameless infant matter? An infant exposed at sea? An infant who never even made it to shore? The cruelty is in the casualness. If Viking Age sources treated infant exposure as tragic, as difficult, as morally complex, we'd have sagas about it. We'd have poems about grief, We'd have mothers defying fathers, saving daughters, hiding babies. But we don't. Gunnlaug's saga presents it as a fact. Thorstein tells Jofridr what will happen. No debate, no protest recorded. Expose the girl, raise the boy, done. That casualness suggests it was normal. It suggests resistance was futile or rare. It suggests women either accepted it or had no choice. The law is clear. The father decides, not the mother. The Norwegian Frostathing law says every child must have a father, not a mother, a father. The child is brought to him. He names it, or he doesn't. The mother's labor, the mother's pain, the mother's body that grew the child, none of that grants her decision power. She delivers. He decides. On a longship, that power dynamic is absolute. On land, maybe a mother could hide a child, give it to relatives, find someone to take it. On a ship, there's nowhere to go. The father is right there. The crew is watching. The ship is moving. The choice is immediate. And if the father says no, the water is right there too. What did it sound like? The baby born at sea, handed to the father, inspected in the gray North Atlantic light. Did it cry? Did the mother? Did the crew turn away, or did they watch? Did anyone pray to Freya? Did anyone mark the moment? Or was it silent, quick, efficient? Wrap the infant. Wait it. Drop it overboard. Move on. 3 more days to Iceland. We'll never know. The sources don't tell us. The archaeology can't tell us. The ocean keeps its dead, but we know the framework. We know the law. We know the practice on land. We know voyages happened. We know women traveled. We know pregnancies occurred. We know the pressure of limited resources. We know the value Vikings placed on strength and survival. From those facts, we can imagine the moment, and the imagination is enough. Here's the reveal that changes everything. In 2017, archaeologists in Eyjafjörður Fjord in North Iceland discovered 3 boat burials. One contained a chieftain, his sword, and his dog. Standard high status, Viking burial. But the location matters. Eyjafjörður is on the north coast of Iceland. Ships coming from Norway via the ocean route or the insular route would have passed near there. It was a landing point, a settlement area, a place where voyages ended. Those boat burials date to the Viking Age settlement period, late 9th, early 10th century, right when Iceland was being settled, right when ships were crossing constantly, right when families were migrating, and in those graves, people were buried with the ships that brought them, the ships that carried them across water, the ships that represented journey, transition, arrival. Those ships didn't have infant remains. None of the excavated Viking ship burials in Iceland show infant burials. The Oseberg ship had 2 adult women. Gokstad had an adult man. Ladby had a chieftain and sacrificed animals. None had infants. Infants weren't ship companions. Infants weren't journey-worthy. Infants were, apparently, not meant to cross water with honor. But here's the thing. Iceland's population grew from 0 to tens of thousands in 60 years, 874 to 930. That's insane demographic growth. And it wasn't all adult immigrants. Women came. Women had children. Some of those children were born in Iceland, but some had to have been born on the crossing. Biology and math demand it. So where are they? Where are the ship burial infants? Where are the settlement infants? Where are the coastal finds of tiny bones? They're not there. Or they're there, and we're not recognizing them. Or they were never buried in ways that preserve. Or they were exposed, and the water took them, and there's nothing left. The absence is the evidence. The silence is the story. In 1904, Gabriel Gustafsson excavated the Oseberg ship and found 2 women and 14 horses and 6 dogs and 2 cows and grave goods worth a queen's ransom. But he didn't find any infant remains. No children at all. These were wealthy, powerful women. They likely had children in life. Where are they? Not in the ship. Not buried alongside. The children, if they survived, were somewhere else. And the children who didn't survive, the ones exposed, the ones deemed uncarried, they were nowhere. That's the unspoken fate. Born at sea or born on land, if the father didn't accept you, you disappeared. No grave, no memorial, no runestone, no saga, just absence. The North Atlantic is full of that absence. Every crossing from 790 to 1100 that included women included the possibility of birth, and every birth included the possibility of exposure. The numbers stack up, thousands of crossings, hundreds of births, dozens, maybe hundreds, of exposures. And we have 0 direct accounts. 0. That's not oversight. That's culture. That's what happens when infants aren't considered people until they're named, until they're carried, until they're integrated into the family and community. Before that, they're potential, and potential can be discarded. Christianity changed this, slowly, incompletely. with compromises and exceptions and resistance, but it changed. By the 12th century, exposure was illegal. By the 13th century, when the sagas were written, the practice was remembered but no longer current. And the saga authors could write about it because it was past, because their Christian audiences would understand it as a pagan practice, as something those people did back then, before Christ, before civilization. But for the women on those ships in the 9th and 10th centuries, it wasn't past, it was present, it was law, it was reality. And when they went into labor with land days away and the Father standing over them and the law giving him full authority, they knew. They knew the odds, they knew the stakes, they knew that naming ceremony was life or death. They knew that the ship itself was more important than an infant who might not survive anyway. 1 in 5 died before 5 years old, even in settled conditions. On a ship, after a traumatic birth, with no shelter and limited resources, the odds were worse. So maybe some fathers made the calculation that even a wanted child wouldn't survive the rest of the voyage. Maybe that made it easier. Maybe that's how they justified it. The baby would die anyway. The water is quicker, cleaner. The gods will decide. Or maybe there was no justification. Maybe it was just math. Resources are finite. Space is limited. The crew comes first. The cargo comes first. The ship comes first. An infant is last. And last means expendable. The Vikings are often romanticized. Brave explorers, skilled sailors, fierce warriors, complex society with art and law and poetry. All of that's true. The Oseberg ship carvings are beautiful. The sagas are literature. The legal codes show sophisticated social organization, but that same society practiced infant exposure. That same legal code gave fathers authority over life and death. That same culture that created beauty also created disposability. And on the longships, on the open water, in the space between Norway and Iceland, between the old world and the new, between departure and arrival, babies were born. And some of them died not because of disease or accident or storm, but because a father looked at them and said no, because the law gave him that power, because the culture accepted it, because the ship had to keep moving and the weak didn't matter. That's the unspoken fate, born at sea. Looked at once, judged unworthy, dropped overboard, forgotten. The North Atlantic swallowed them and kept their stories. And the sagas that came later, written by Christian authors who knew the old ways, preserved the practice in passing. If you bear a girl, expose her, but never described the moment itself, never gave us the scene, never showed us the mother's face or the infant's cry or the water closing over. Just silence, gray water, cold wind, the ship moving on, 3 more days to Iceland, another crossing complete, another voyage survived. The ones who made it to shore with names, with acceptance, with father's blessing, they became Icelanders. They founded families. They appear in sagas. They have graves, descendants, genetic legacies. They matter. The ones who didn't make it, the ones exposed, the ones uncarried, they're in the silence. They're in the absence. They're in the ratio of male to female burials. They're in the archaeological gaps. They're in the legal exceptions. They're in the casual saga dialogue about exposing girls. They're in the water. They're in the story no one wrote down because it wasn't a story. It was just how things were. And that's the coldest part. Not that it happened, but that it was normal. That's the part that sits in your chest when you read the sources, when you see the patterns, when you realize the evidence is in what's missing. Viking Age, Scandinavia had art, law, exploration, trade, literature, crafty eye, social complexity, and infant exposure. Both things were true. Beautiful ship carvings and dead babies, sophisticated legal codes and uncarried infants, successful transatlantic crossings and mothers laboring in the bottom of boats, knowing their child might not survive the father's inspection. The Oseberg ship sits in a museum in Oslo now, restored, preserved, protected. The carvings still visible after 1,200 years, the wood still holding its shape, the beauty still present, but the ship also carried the reality of its time, the law of its culture, the practice of exposure, the father's power, the infant's vulnerability, the mother's helplessness, the water's finality. Every Viking ship that crossed the North Atlantic carried that reality. Every voyage with women aboard carried that possibility. Every birth at sea ended with a decision, named or uncarried, carried or exposed, memory or silence. We don't have the accounts, we have the framework, and the framework tells us enough. Some babies born on Viking longships never saw land. Never got names, never became stories, they're just gone. And the sagas, written centuries later by people who knew what exposure meant, never gave them voices, never mourned them, never even acknowledged them except in passing. In dialogue, in legal code, they're in the silence, and the silence is the story.